Hey everyone, welcome to the Balanced Lens, where we examine faith, culture, and politics from a balanced perspective. I say balanced perspective because we try to lay out the facts for a pragmatic analysis and then apply Christian biblical worldview. Today we're talking about a topic that's been hot on the news. It's the U.S. interest in Greenland and a possible acquisition or maybe a takeover. I guess we'll see as you listen to the podcast. But to understand this, it's important to look at the history of Greenland, its beginnings, its government, its culture. And so we'll start off by examining what is the history of Greenland and how and why are they currently a part of the Kingdom of Denmark?
So Greenland, in its native language, is called Kalaallit Nunaat, is the world's largest island, about 836,000 square miles, which is roughly about the size of Mexico, but it still has one of the smallest populations on Earth, which is only like 56,000 or 57,000 people. And it makes it the least densely populated territory globally. Its capital is Nuuk, and which hosts like a third of its population in subpolar conditions. So imagine dark winters, brief summers. And while it's geographically aligned with North America, Greenland sits outside the European Union, but inside the Kingdom of Denmark. And we will dive into it later. It uses the Danish currency, krone, and it relies on Denmark for foreign affairs, defense, and monetary policy. Around 90% of its residents are Inuit or of mixed Inuit-Danish ancestry. And they are concentrated in the small coastal communities in the fringes, mostly in the southwest, south, and southeast coast. About 80% of Greenland is actually covered by Greenlandic ice sheet, which is the second largest after Antarctica. And there are some estimates based on measurements that says that it's losing about 266 billion metric tons annually since 2002. And there's a potential that it's going to raise the sea levels. So that's something that people are looking out for. In terms of economy, fishing dominates its exports, about 90% of which are shrimp and halibut, and it has some emerging markets in mining of rare earths, rubies, uranium, but that was kind of blunted a little bit through the 2021 hydrocarbon ban, which emphasizes sustainability. Interesting fact is there is their dog, which is called a Greenland dog. It was introduced by their native population around 1,000 CE, banned from exporting for purity purposes. Biodiversity includes polar bears, musk oxen, about 200 plus variety of birds. But interestingly, it has no native trees. So timber is imported. One of the sad facts over there is that it's got the world's highest suicide rate, which is about 81 per 100,000. Which is mostly tied to isolation and possibly some of the colonial traumas from the past. Its GDP, it's about 3.5 billion, but it's got a purchasing power parity, the PPP, of about 79,000, which, if you want to compare, it's very similar to the average EU economies. But there's one caveat. Half of their public budget actually comes from an annual block grant from Denmark, which roughly is about $625 million. Greenland is actually socially progressive. Like, we don't expect this, but they're very socially progressive. Education and healthcare are free, and LGBTQ rights are among the most extensive in the Arctic region. But another interesting fact is that there are no roads that connect major towns. So the way people travel is either by air, by boat, or snowmobile, or maybe a dog sled. And this logistical fact shapes everything that we see in this country, in this island. Militarily, we have a base over there. It's called the Bitufik Space Base, or the Thule Space Base. It's meant for missile warning, established during the Cold War. So that's one of the things that we have over there. Diving into your second question on how it became part of Denmark. So let's go back a little bit historically so we can kind of track the peoples of Greenland. There were some Paleo-Inuit population, like it's called the Sakak, that arrived in 2500 BC. And they basically migrated. It's commonly thought that they migrated from the northern region of North America. So think north of Canada, and they were hunters using stone tools. And by about 1200 CE, the Thule Inuit, which are the modern ancestors of the people right now, they arrived with whaling technologies, dog sleds, and they thrived on ivory trade. Interestingly, right, what it says is like the first settlers and most of the current peoples are actually North American in heritage as well. So in addition to being in the Northern Hemisphere, they're actually part of North America. They actually migrated from North America. Now, how did Denmark get entangled in this? So there were the Scandinavian settlers called the Norse settlers, which was led by Eric the Red. He established colonies in southern Greenland around the late 10th century. They built farms, churches, trading stations, but about 500 years or so later, they kind of faded away and disappeared. And historians think it's most likely due to the light ice age that happened around that time, around 14 or so. And so they could not thrive. They did not learn how to thrive in this very taxing weather conditions like the native Greenlanders did. Then in 1721, Danish Norwegian, there was a person named Hans Egede who set up a mission near present-day Nuuk, the capital. And then over the next couple of centuries, Denmark recolonized the island and established trading posts and asserted colonial control and monopolies. So they were trading monopolies with that island. In 1814, there was a Treaty of Kiel, which ended the union between Denmark and Norway. So Denmark and Norway were connected till then. But once the union ended, it left Greenland, along with Iceland and the Faroe Islands, to Denmark. So at that point, Danish sovereignty was cemented. So then for two centuries after that, Greenland functioned as a Danish colony, built around trade monopoly in fish, whale products, and other marine goods. And they had the Danish language, schooling, through Christianity, shaping local society. Then fast forward to World War II. In 1941, the Nazis occupied Denmark. And at that point, upon request, U.S. took Greenland under its wing. And the U.S. built bases, protected the island. And after the war, for the agreement, President Harry Truman offered Greenland back to Denmark. But given its strategic location, President Truman actually offered $100 million in gold to buy it. Denmark said no at that point, and they continued to say no. So some other shifts that's happening after World War II. You have, in 1953, Denmark has changed the status of Greenland to a province in order to avoid any United Nations decolonization pressures. But then Greenland ceased to be a colony and became an integral part of the Kingdom of Denmark at that point. In 1979, Denmark granted Greenland home rule, which was followed by the Self-Government Act in 2009, which essentially recognizes Greenlanders as a people with a right of self-determination, and it devolves most domestic policies. So Greenland has a right to determine if it wants to be independent or not. But the caveat is that if it chooses to leave the Kingdom of Denmark, it will lose the annual block grant that's been given which is about $620 million. So today, fast forward, what happens is Greenland runs its internal affairs. Health, education, resource policy is all governed by the government of Greenland, while Denmark governs the defense, foreign policy, its currency, and overall constitutional framework that's governed by Denmark.
Yeah, really thorough, excellent overview. And what's fascinating is that this is a region with so much influence, as you mentioned, right? The Inuit culture, the Viking influence, the Danish influence, the American influence after World War II. Christianity is the most dominant religion in Greenland. You've alluded to this, Biju. 95% belong to the Lutheran Church of Greenland. Most popular food is something called susat. I might be butchering the name. It's a national dish, basically soup with seal meat, with potato and onions. Doesn't sound too appetizing to me. Whale meat is also a delicacy there. The major language is Greenlandic. There's another more proper way to say their language that I'm going to butcher, but know that it's Greenlandic. But this is a region that many people have not thought about until maybe a few weeks ago. However, it has been an area of interest for decades for various reasons. And so we're going to jump into some of those reasons. Now, the United States isn't the only country that has a desire to be in the region. In fact, there are other countries that have an interest in that region. One of those countries is Russia. Russia has a lot of strategic value to be in Greenland. And so, why would Russia want to be involved in this Arctic Circle and around Greenland?
Something to really watch out for. So, Russia is the dominant military power right now in the Arctic, basing its northern fleet and a large nuclear arsenal on the Kola Peninsula and building what NATO analysts call a bastion defense strategy to control key sea routes like the Gap. So Giuk is GIUK, which stands for Greenland, Iceland, UK, and the United Kingdom. If you look at the map, you will see how the oceans are connected through that region. Now, how is Moscow doing this? It's reopened or upgraded 50 plus Soviet-era bases, built new airfields and radar stations along the northern coast, deployed or tested systems ranging from hypersonic missiles to nuclear capable torpedoes, with the Arctic routes central to its nuclear second strike plans. So, one of the things to note is that Russia has deployed S-400 missiles and two 160 bombers that are capable of reaching North America within minutes. They have reactivated 100 plus bases, the Northern Fleet, which has 32 warships and more than 33 subs, and the North Pole flag, if you remember, which that planting symbolized their claims of the Arctic. So they are using an additional fleet of 40 plus icebreakers, which, by the way, includes nuclear-powered ones as well, to control the shipping lanes that are actually 40% faster than the Suez Canal. So it's very strategic to what they're doing and why they're doing it. Also point to remember is that the Arctic holds, right now the estimates say, about 13% of undiscovered oil, 30% of gas, and the melting ice opens up the northern sea route, cutting Asia-Europe transit by 40%. Russia claims extended continental shelf. There is a ridge, it's called the Lomonosov Ridge, which is near Greenland, and that's based on its United Nations submissions. We can look at it, and they're claiming sovereignty over that area as well. So, senior Norwegian and NATO officials describe Norway as the alliance's eyes and ears in that region because it's in the far north, and it highlighting the likelihood that in a crisis, Russian submarines would push to the gaps between Norway, the Svalbard, Iceland, and Greenland, making Greenland part of a wider contested theater. So it's very strategic what it's doing in order to dominate the seas. And because once you're able to dominate the seas and the area and the air, not only are you're laying claims to a lot of route that is going to be very important in the coming years and decades.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this podcast, it's important for a reader to take a map or look at your phone and look at it from the perspective of the North Pole. And you realize Russia is extremely close to Greenland and Canada. In fact, they're actually neighbors across the Arctic Circle. And so, as Biju mentioned, number one, there are key Arctic routes in the area. Number one is the Northern Passage, which is really controlled by Canada, and then the Northern Sea Route, which remains this Russian-controlled corridor. And so Greenland, it sits in this area where the Atlantic Ocean, it meets the Arctic Ocean. And so Russian ships and submarines heading south from these bases around this Arctic region, they pass through, Greenland, Iceland, this Gaiac route. All of this is NATO territory, by the way. And so these are, it's in this vital defensive zone for the United States and for NATO. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, more eyes have been opened. NATO has actually increased their air and sea patrol of these waters along where these Russian maritime routes are. Now, Russia dominates this northern sea route. If you look at the numbers, it's actually quite scary, as Biju mentioned. I had chills when you actually mentioned some of those numbers, but they dominate the Northern Sea Route. They are the major player in the Arctic. They dominate the icebreaker fleet. They have nuclear-powered ships that are actually underneath the ice in the Arctic. Russia has more Arctic military bases than NATO in the Arctic, and the nuclear submarine presence is formidable. And so, you look at this area, and the second reason why it's important, not only is it those maritime routes that are present today, but Arctic ice is melting. By 2035, it's expected that shipping between Europe and Asia is expected to increase by 40%. Many of these maritime shipping routes are expected to create these new polar and northern sea routes for global trade, making Greenland as important as Panama or the Suez Canal. And so as these routes open up, as this ice melts, this will become vital to supply chain, continental defense. Russia is spending 110 billion to build megaports. They're actually actively developing their Arctic region. This is not stuff you hear on the news, right? Like you don't get Russian headlines on your news, but they're spending $110 billion to build megaports across the Arctic in preparation of the opening of these northern sea lanes. So they are thinking 10 years ahead. So, number one, we talked about the current routes. Secondly, we talked about the Arctic ice melting in the future. Um, Thirdly, we alluded to this island being pivotal to NATO's air defense. If you take a map or a globe and you look at the North Pole, the shortest flight path between Moscow and Washington, D.C., it's an arc known as the Great Circle Distance. Greenland sits right in the middle. And so this is strategically important for Russia to be in this area. If Russia or China were to fire, intercontinental ballistic missiles at the U.S., many would cross over Greenland. And so the U.S. has many early missile warning systems there in Greenland. During the Cold War, the U.S. and allies had bases across Greenland. Forces there were on the lookout for Soviet ships. It was much more strategically monitored during that time. Today, we only have about 150 troops, down from about 15,000. Now, it's interesting to note regarding Russian presence in the Arctic Circle. Interesting take from a Dane Arctic commander about the security situation in Greenland. And this is verbatim from this Danish Arctic commander. He said this: expectation is that Russia will use all the resources they've used in Ukraine and turn to other areas, including the Arctic. Nothing urgent, but we actually expect an increase in Russian activities in the coming year. We also see Chinese and Russian ships up here. So it's remarkable that while official rhetoric kind of downplays the risks, those who are actually in the Arctic water are citing this huge risk from Russian buildup. But we've talked about China. We've alluded to that a little bit. Russia is not only the only player in this region, China is actually actively involved in this region as well. And so how and why is China in the Arctic Circle? Why are they invested in Greenland so much?
So one interesting fact, and it's kind of defies any logic, China declared itself a near Arctic state in 2018. It announced a polar Silk Road, which is part of their Belt and Road Initiative. And it constantly seeks new shipping routes across the warming Arctic so that they have better and quicker access to resources. Greenland's rare earths is another big thing. So their rare earth and critical minerals have attracted Chinese companies starting in the 2010s, by the way. I think the earliest was 2012. And this was especially triggered after the 2009 the law was passed, which gave Greenland more control over how it decided to allocate its resource policy. Remember that this Western capital was kind of scarce in terms of its financial ability. And remember also at that time, we are talking about the 2008-2009 financial crisis that the US and other Western countries were completely drowning in. So around this time is when China takes advantage. Chinese firms pursued or considered investments in rare earth projects and in airports and other infrastructure, which was often backed by Beijing's broader Arctic policy, which essentially encourages state-linked companies to invest in Arctic resourcing and shipping. One thing to keep for our listeners to keep in mind, China currently processes 85% of all the world's rare earths, and they view Greenland's deposits as a way to maintain their global stranglehold on the components needed for very important equipments like the fives, the EVs that our population is now depending on, and the AI infrastructure and data centers that is the future of what we believe is happening right now. These moves from China actually did alarm people in the policy makers in Denmark, the EU, and the US, who saw the risk of Beijing gaining political leverage through control of key infrastructure and the mineral supply chain in a NATO-linked territory. Then one interesting thing that happened after that in 2021 was the domestic politics shift, where there were mining parties that gained ground. I'm talking in 2021, and they stalled a lot of the large projects that focused on mining because they were worried about environmental damage and foreign dependence. There has been some stalling thankfully, but it is for no, it's no thanks to any of the other players like Denmark and the US. It was more internal and local. But that's a situation. And so it's very important when we think through Russia, China, and what exactly is happening, we should have a 25-year game plan and strategy, right? So that we can then develop tactics that are beneficial to the US and its allies.
Yeah, excellent points. And what's scary and interesting here, and for the readers, if you don't notice, you need to Google China's Silk Road policy and Silk Road initiatives. And it's amazing how extensive this is across the globe. I mean, they have a presence in every continent, and their goal is to really capture the infrastructure as suitable to their own interests. And so, as Biju mentioned, one of those tangents is the Polar Silk Road, which is essentially their plan to gather the infrastructure in the Arctic and use it for their interests. And so during the past years, China's attempted to grow its footprint in the region through, research expeditions, infrastructure investments, natural resource acquisitions. The flip side of that is this: as Greenland has gained some independence, the people have had more of a voice. They've been eager to diversify their economy away from fishing, away from the maritime, away from Danish financial aid, to actually seek economic opportunities that are beneficial to themselves. So Chinese involvement has been something they've entertained. Now, we talked about this, but one of the reasons why China wants to be in Greenland is the rare earth minerals. China wants to secure critical resources, particularly these rare earth minerals where it already dominates. They want to reduce EU and US dependency. These natural resources are in Greenland. Greenland is rich in iron ore, graphite, tungsten, palladium, vanadium, zinc, gold, uranium, copper, and oil. But again, the resources that attract the most attention are the rare earth minerals. And so what's interesting, some of the largest rare earth deposits in the world are in two of these mines there. One is called the Covanfield mine and the Ten Breeze mine. The harsh Arctic climate has made it difficult to mine in these areas. However, in recent years, there's been more infrastructure investment into these areas, which we'll talk about in a second. Another reason why China likes Greenland, a huge export partner. China serves mainly as one of the most important markets for the Greenlandic fishing industry. They've become the second most important export destination for Greenland. In terms of infrastructure, in the last 10 years, they sought to invest in Greenland's airports. Really fascinating if you read this, actually. China has sought to invest in Greenland's airports, abandoned naval stations, satellite ground stations. But a lot of these ambitions have been stalled because US and Danish stakeholders have raised an eye. Chinese infrastructure becomes clear when you look at the fact that there are holding companies that have sought to take over some of these bases. And the government of Denmark has stepped in to stop this. A lot of this, again, has been flagged as security concerns. The Danes are not eager to let Chinese involvement in Greenland grow. So by many metrics, the Arctic Silk Road strategy has failed to take off due to prohibitions from the Danish government. Now, what is interesting here, there is a mine called the Covanfield project, where Chinese firm Shanghai Resources holds a significant stake. So they do hold a significant stake in this mining company in Greenland. There's another project called the Isua Iron Ore Project by the General Nice Group, a Chinese company that developed this project, but had their license revoked by Greenland due to non-compliance. And so the current status of Chinese involvement is that they're seeking active ways to be a part of Greenlandic infrastructure. However, many of these projects have stalled due to Greenlandic policy changes. There was a uranium ban recently, Western scrutiny, or Danish scrutiny. Now, this has also put tension between the Danes and the Greenlandic peoples and the people of Greenland, because many of the people in Greenland, they're eager to diversify their economy. They're looking at ways to invite other countries in, and the Danes have wisely been skeptical and scrutinized these deals and held them off. And so it's interesting how China has an active role in this region. They've been actively involved in attempting to own some of this infrastructure and gain a foothold here. But looking at all this from a high level view, how does all this influence the US and their allies? I mean, this is the Arctic Pole. Is this really affecting you and me tomorrow? For those who live in America, does it matter to us?
Right. And this is why it's very important for our audience to be aware and involved in geopolitical affairs. because it is important. It may not be important for us in the next 3 years. It'll be important in the lifetime of our children. And the decisions we make today impact lives tomorrow. We covered a lot of these points, right? From the US and NATO perspective, Greenland matters because we have early warning radars and space tracking at our airbase in Thule. They're trying to monitor Russian missiles, space activity. We also have Greenland's position on the sea route, the northern sea routes, and it's crucial for tracking Russian submarines that move around in that area. And then Greenland obviously have the rare earth and the minerals that we were talking about, which would diversify Western supply chains away from being stranglehold by China. From Russia's perspective, they have a huge military buildup. They have potential operations that are raising the stakes for NATO's ability now to monitor and control that region. And it makes Greenland, therefore, an important flank in a broader competition in that space. From Chinese perspective, their economic and infrastructure leverage in Greenland could, in theory, give Beijing influence over their policy choices, their political choices that they make, and create a security dilemma. If some of the investments they're making are going to be like dual use, right, with the ports, the airfields, the telecom, which are built by Chinese firms. So even if formal control is with Denmark, it doesn't stop if China has extensive stakes in the operations and how things are done. So I would say from all that on the research that I've done, EU and US policymakers increasingly view Greenland as a de-risking, as a key point in the de-risking agenda in critical materials. And we want to ensure that any Greenlandic mining that happens, it enables Western and Greenlandic people's prosperity and security and safety rather than the Chinese or the Russians dominating the process, the chains.
Yeah, and the perception right now in the news, at least to most of the world, is that you read these posts that Donald Trump is putting out, and the perception is that we have this egotistical, narcissistic administration that's pursuing like 18th century colonialism. But if you really look at the facts, if you're just objective, take away your partisan bias, whether you're Democrat or Republican or Libertarian or whatever, just look at the facts and you realize this is a vital, integral part of American and European security. This is an important zone for all those reasons mentioned above. But to you as a Christian, right, for our listeners who are Christians, these are important questions to answer because number one, God is sovereign over nations. The Bible teaches that God raises up and brings down nations. Borders, leaders, historical moments, they're not accidents. They're all under the sovereignty and providence of God. Geopolitics reminds us that the world's events unfold under God's authority, not outside it. Daniel 2:21 says that he removes kings and raises them up. Secondly, nations exist for order, right? They don't exist for chaos. The job of a government and the role of a Christian to participate in a government and to understand geopolitics is to realize that government's role is to restrain evil and promote good, as Romans 13 says. When governments and countries collapse, vulnerable people suffer the most. Christians should care about issues like Greenland, not just because of our national security, that's huge, but because this order protects life, it protects families, it protects communities. Tyranny and corruption, lawlessness, they're not moral issues, right? They're also political ones. Human sin also shapes international conflict, war, oppression, exploitation. Geopolitics is a large-scale reflection of Genesis chapter 3. The power struggles, right? We mentioned these various countries trying to enter into Greenland. All of this should prompt Christians to approach geopolitics realistically, not naively. The gospel spreads through political reality. God uses political systems to advance his purposes. And so we should consider that our involvement in Greenland has an influence on the gospel. And so all this has been on the news. It's exploded in the last few weeks. This has been a talk of the previous Trump administration in an acquisition of Greenland, but this has really exploded in the last week. And so what is the Trump administration's stance on Greenland, and what's the reasoning behind desiring Greenland at this time?
President Trump has now explicitly called for the complete and total purchase of Greenland, and he frames it as essential to U.S. national security, suggesting that if Washington does not act, Russia or China will eventually take the island. And to force the issue President Trump announced new 10% tariffs on imports from 8 European allies, which includes Denmark, Sweden, France, Germany, Finland, Netherlands, Norway, and the UK, with threats to raise it up to 25% by June 1st, unless a deal is reached. So the Trump administration argues that a U.S. control, this is their reasoning, the U.S. control would secure the Arctic flank against Russia and cement U.S. command of the missile defense and space tracking infrastructure. If Russia or China launches a missile over the pole, our space base in Bitufik sees it first. And Washington fears that if Greenland goes fully independent, they might let China build a research station or an airport, which will effectively put a Chinese base in our backyard. The second thing is like a U.S. control locks down access to rare earths and other critical minerals, which then reduces our dependence on Chinese supply chains, especially, as we mentioned earlier, since these minerals are important for our military equipment, our semiconductors, our AI future. So there is a lot riding on it. And just for context for our listeners, Greenland holds 1.5 million metric tons of rare earth reserves. And these elements are needed for our F-35 fighter jets, our EV motors, etc. And remember, we talked about China controlling 85% of the processing. They also control 70% of the entire market. Right? It's 85% of processing, but 70% of the entire market. And so Washington is viewing Greenland not just simply as an island, but it's strategic in nature. It also wants to prevent any rival powers outside of Russia and China from getting either military or economic footholds in the island. So to note, in terms of its thinking, there are some politicians who are aligned with the idea, like Senator Tom Cotton, and they back it, and they call the acquisition the best course of action for U.S. national security. But there are others, like Senator Lisa Murkowski, who criticize the tariff strategy as unnecessary. So there are multiple views, as is always the case in Congress. But this is the stance that the administration is taking and their reasoning.
And what's interesting is that in the long tweet Donald Trump put out last week, he mentioned something called the Golden Dome, which is essentially the U.S. plan for missile defense for intercontinental ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, cruise missiles, advanced drones. A lot of these things can be launched now from space. A lot of these things can be launched from other continents. And so it's important to think about our national defense in terms of intercontinental threats, not just like a plane flying over your head. But one of the urgent reasons behind the acquisition of Greenland is these threats that are now escalating, especially from Russia, especially from China, across the Arctic. Now, in terms of the tariff strategy, one of the reasons that the administration has cited behind placing a tariff on nations that will essentially attempt to block this deal is that the U.S. has effectively shouldered a large share of the collective defense of NATO, burdened through its massive overall military spending and presence in Europe. Over 2/3 of NATO defense spending is attributed to the U.S. and by the U.S. This contributes to troop deployments, equipment prepositioning exercises, just a broader defense system all across Europe. And the question has been, why is the U.S. spending exorbitant amounts of money and not essentially receiving any type of guarantee or benefit from this? Now, with respect to Denmark, Denmark is a tiny country with a tiny economy, a tiny military, wonderful people, but militarily, can they defend Greenland? Probably not. Again, the EU, can they defend Greenland? We've already seen that with Ukraine, the United States had to come to the defense of the EU when a nuclear superpower was at their border. And so the current position is, why would the current U.S. administration spend billions upon billions of dollars to defend a territory that is 25% bigger than Alaska at 100% expense to American citizens? And yet, while we do that, to allow this territory to be controlled 100% by Denmark and the EU. And so it's an unfair deal in terms of our current administration's position. And it's a position I agree with. I think that this is a vital, integral asset to American and European defense. But looking at this as a long-term position, there have been other presidents that have attempted to acquire Greenland. President Andrew Johnson, 1867, 1868. 1910, President Taft, President Truman, 1946, Eisenhower, 55. First Trump administration talked about Greenland. Why this urgency now? Why, with so much vigor and force, has this become a national issue where people are enraged by how Trump has been approaching this through his tariff strategy, threatening NATO allies? Why this urgent stance right now?
You mentioned about the attempts to acquire Greenland, which shows that this has been considered a national security strategy for over 150 years now, right? Since 1867. And the fact that we haven't been able to realize that is kind of disappointing given the contribution the US has made to both of the biggest wars since then, like the World War One and World War Two, how Denmark was completely overrun. And just so our audience has perspective, we're talking about 6 million people. Denmark. The US is 350 million. Denmark is 6 million. They were completely overrun by the Nazis. They didn't even stand a chance. The Nazi Germany just walked right in. And the US had to take care of Greenland. And we were, I guess, gentlemanly, so we gave it back to Denmark. So again, the caveat is that we don't know what all the Trump administration has been communicating with Denmark and the EU since 2016, because President Trump talked about this even in his first administration. So we don't know what all has transpired for it to get to this point where it just seems on the face value very aggressive tariff threats, and we are not ruling out military takeover. It just seems excessive. But some of the reasoning, just to make sure that people understand some of the things that are going on, we talked about Russia, we talked about China. Russia's aggressive behavior in Ukraine, especially 2022, it's really a red flag. And they also have stepped up, like consciously stepped up Arctic militarization. They're taking northern bases and sea lanes. So now it feels really urgent to make sure that things don't go sideways. At 10 years from now, we are now trying to repair things that could have actually been, well, I wouldn't even say this is proactive anymore, but this is the right time. If not now, it's going to be too late. Another reason is intensifying competition with China over critical minerals. We have clearly seen how China can hold the US hostage when it comes to these minerals, and we have no leverage in this avenue, which is not a good thing. So critical minerals, semiconductors, clean energy supply chains, we really need to make sure that from a strategy perspective, Greenland is aligned with us. It doesn't have to be our territory or state, but it has to be fully aligned with us. Then we have Greenland's own moves, right, for greater self-rule in 2009, which now gives Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, control over its resources. And the problem now is, like, you don't know what they're going to do and who they're going to bring in, who they're going to allocate it to. So I would say until now, we have been able to secure the region and oversee the policies and happenings via defense agreements and our base that's out there, etc. But we do need to make sure at this point of time, given all the things that are happening in the world, just one more point. Remember, China is actively trying to take over Taiwan as well. Okay, so between Russia and China, who seem to be buddies, maybe not in terms of overall ideologies, but definitely circumstantial. They're taking advantage of it completely. The reason why the Russia is still able to fund its war is because of China, right? And China is gaining the partnership from Russia as well. So this is something we have to think about it strategically and not just solely from the focus of being completely naive, right? 100% I agree with making sure Greenlanders have their rights. We should not treat their property with despise. We have to make sure that the environmental factors are taken into account. But there are a lot of things that are happening right now that is clearly pointing to action being needed right now.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that I think because this has been in the news for so long, people didn't take this seriously until Trump tweeted last week that he's going to impose tariffs on European nations. And I think everyone then raised an eyebrow. They said, this guy's really serious about taking over Greenland. But I think there's also another angle to this. The Chinese had actively courted and wooed politicians all over the world for the goal of investing in the infrastructure, taking over national projects for their own interests. And there is some talk that within Denmark, there have been collaboration between people within Denmark, Russia, and China in efforts to undermine the US, to undermine the EU and Western nations, and to allow Russia and China to do things. So this is presumed to have set off a chain reaction within the intel community. And so, again, a lot of this is conjecture. It's not going to be on the headlines tomorrow in any newspaper, but interesting to think about what is happening behind the scenes here that could have stoked so much interest in such a short amount of time. But given the current US stance and reasoning, if we look at US security, we look at EU and international security, we look at UN laws and Greenlandic liberties, is the current US stance correct? I mean, are we just living in an echo chamber because we're American citizens and maybe we're hearing our own press? Is this bad? Are we in the wrong here? Are we becoming colonialists, or are we actually doing a good thing for the West here?
So from an assessment perspective, the claim that Greenland is strategically important is well founded, right? Like we mentioned, we are talking about 150 years of history in terms of the strategy being consistently advising the US government to ensure that there is alignment with Greenland. Nobody is seizing it to control it, right? There was always money involved. There was always a reward involved in this acquisition or in this alignment. US and EU analysts have consistently highlighted its role in early warning, in the Arctic sea lanes that we talked about, and future mineral supply. So they are all important. There is no imminent danger, if that's, some people have been using this language of imminent. I don't think it's a matter of imminent. It's not that Russia is going to take over Greenland tomorrow. That's not the question. But the question is, will that happen in 5 years, in 10 years, if we don't act now? From an EU NATO ally perspective, our allies have said that the way we are doing it, right? Is the assessment correct? Yes. Is the approach correct? Now, that's it. That's something that we can debate. Like when we talk about NATO and the EU, we have been allied. We have been allied for a long time. We have been friends for a long time. Unequal friends, to be fair. US has unfairly, a lot would argue, bore a lot of the burden, which should have been borne by everybody. But to completely to like raise the tariffs, to threaten them and risk breaking the NATO may not be a smart idea, because we do need allies. Allies are important. You may need to sometimes shake them up a little bit. The question is this the right way to shake them up and get their attention? Again, from an approach perspective, I'm going back to approach. Assessment is flat out correct. From the methodology we're applying, based on international law and UN norms, it's clear that this type of territorial acquisition is not allowed. Their Greenlanders are considered to be a distinct people, and they have self-determination rights. And we have seen it all over the news. Both the Denmark's government, Greenland's government, and both their peoples have clearly said that Greenland is not for sale. And so that's something to take into account. So overall, our concern and our assessment is spot on. We have to act. There has to be something done to make sure there is alignment. And I come back to alignment. It's not necessarily acquisition. There has to be alignment. The question is, how do we do it in a way that optimizes the outcome and not create a lot more enemies? Like I'll give you one tangential example that we saw a few days ago, where Canada is striking a deal with China on EVs, and I was scratching my head. So we have to be careful, because there's a chance that allies will get spooked, because remember, they're weaker allies in terms of military. They may get spooked and end up doing something that is actually against their own interest and our overall NATO interests. So it's something to watch out for.
Yeah, another interesting thing to think about is, we talk about Russia and China and Greenland and national security, but here's another interesting angle. There seems to be a growing mistrust of Europe and Canada that you alluded to. And I'll highlight some of these points, but could some of these points be the reasons why the US is now so aggressively pursuing Greenland? Number one, I think it's pretty obvious that Europe has now been overrun by mismanaged political and military and social infrastructure. Sadly, Europe seems to have become a deeply unreliable ally. There's increasingly this rollout of the red carpet for its enemies. Europe continues this path of self-harm through, I guess, geopolitical passivity, maybe geopolitical suicide. There's this climate obsession, right? This net zero obsession. There's this open border policy. And so all of this is making America question how reliable are our European allies. Europe wants protection, but they haven't met their NATO commitment. They funded these massive social programs, which are now problems. Sweden gives 480 days of paid parental leave. Germany has free public universities. 25% of France's national budget goes to public pensions. All of this while the US is covering 2/3 of NATO defense costs. So much so that in this last war between Ukraine and Russia, the United States had to essentially step in and defend an entire continent because of all these social problems that were being funded as their own defense spending was being neglected. And so that imbalance and perhaps the European arrogance behind it, I don't know for a better word, is maybe why Greenland is on the table right now. So, number one, there's this distrust of Europe. Secondly, I think there's this changing geopolitical landscape with the UK. Britain has an open immigration policy. They import third world values, anti Western values. It's likely, and many people have said this, that the UK could possibly become the world's first Islamic nuclear superpower because of just how powerful of a nation they are. Their premier foreign policy think tank called the Chatham House, they've been issuing releases or press releases stating that they may need to find support from a nation other than America or diversify away from the EU towards perhaps some South American countries. The Chatham House is worried about the reports of potential U.S. cooperation deals with other countries which may be antithetical to UK interests. There's also questions about UK alliances with China. Keir Starmer, he's currently handing over the Chagos Islands, which is a British territory, to Mauritius. Sorry, I'm butchering the name here. Again, a Chinese ally. This is a chain of islands in the Indian Ocean. But another concern, thirdly, we talked about the unreliability of the EU. We talked about the UK. It's Canada, right? What just happened last week in Canada should be mind-blowing. They linked this deal now with the CCP for EVs and a lot of different trade deals. And the damaging and the dangerous part about this was the actual context of how all this happened. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, he went to China. He cozied up to them with this new set of trade deals. But what he did was he made a speech that raised eyebrows everywhere. And he made a comment about a new world order in a meeting with the Chinese premier. Quote unquote, he said, "The world has changed much since that last visit. I believe the progress that we made in the partnership sets us up well for the new world order." Like, what does that mean, right? You are Canada. You are our greatest ally to the north. At least they were until last week. And now they're cozying up to a communist, human rights abusing country. Now, if this is what their PM is saying in the open, can you imagine what he's saying behind closed doors? As early as February 2025, which is about a year ago, the Western Standard, they said this. They had an investigative journalist for the Bureau, Sam Cooper. He uncovered evidence linking Mark Carney to a network of foreign entities, including entities tied to China and a lot of the trade and finance arms within China. And so there have been questions around Canadian loyalty to American interests and who exactly our politicians are wooing and embracing behind closed doors. And so it's crazy to think, right? There are these tensions within NATO, within our own allies like Canada, within the EU that are really brewing. And it could be, and I think this is a huge part of why Greenland now is essential. There's a possibility that some of our allies in the EU could one day turn against the US. There's a possibility that our neighbor to the north could usurp our very own control. And so Greenland now has an even more strategic importance. But thinking through our strategy now, right? We've pursued this idea of tariffing nations until submission. Is the administration pursuing the best approach to realizing its goal? What have been the reactions from other countries, from Denmark, from Greenland and EU? What are the future ramifications if things go wrong here?
So my first impression is that President Trump is being a little overly aggressive. The tariffs can and probably realistically should be considered to be a bully tactic. But the caveat I would say is that I do not know what has already transpired in the background. Like, what's been going on? Is it that he did exhaust diplomatic avenues? And I'm not surprised because they've been saying no for the last 150 or so years. They just kept saying no. And so now President Trump is forced to use a much more coercive strategy. Overall, I admit in some of the dealings that President Trump has done from a foreign policy perspective, his methodology often comes off as unconventional, sometimes disrespectful, but it does garner pro-US results. And I hope that this is the case with Greenland. Time will tell. From a reactions perspective, Denmark's prime minister has said that Europe will not be blackmailed and that the decisions of Denmark will rest with Denmark and Greenland alone, not with outside pressure. And I know everybody within Greenland and Denmark is, they proclaim that Greenland is not for sale. And they talk about this sounding like colonization, which we know it isn't. We have the EU leaders convening an emergency summit right now and signaling a united response, including like retaliatory tariffs and coordinated diplomatic measures if President Trump proceeds. We also know that NATO has moved to show solidarity with Denmark, deploying personnel to Greenland for exercises under the Danish lead. It's meant as a signal to Washington as much as Moscow. Now, NATO, Russia is interesting. Like they are sitting on the sidelines and they're like, we really like how the US and EU are fighting and they're going at each other's throats. They love it. This is their dream. They also are a little concerned that NATO is now conducting exercises around Greenland and they're taking that area more seriously because Trump has made this a big highlight. Russia's reaction is interesting because they have both the sides of the coin. Partly they're grinning and partly they are scratching their heads to figure out what's their next move.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting thinking about these relationships between these countries, right? You always want to think about the worst case scenario because I think a lot of these worst case scenarios have been played out on the news. I don't think this will happen, as you mentioned. I am going to list some of these, but I think there's a difference between TV politics, what we hear, and what happens in the closed backdoor room of how these deals actually go down. But some worst case scenarios here. Number one, a permanent rupture in the US European alliance could be national suicide. It could trigger major fissures and ruptures in NATO at its core. The EU represents America's largest trade relationship. Just last week, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, he called for the EU to activate a very potent and powerful trade weapon called the anti-coercion measure. If used, it could restrict U.S. access to the EU market, potentially blocking U.S. banks from EU procurement. It could target U.S. tech giants, really cripple a lot of U.S. exports to the EU. Now, this has never been used before, but it has been put on the table. Along those lines, within the NATO relationship, we would have to consider the possibility of closing many of our U.S. military bases on the European continent. Ramstein base in Germany, Aviano in Italy, Lakenheath in the UK. This would limit the U.S.'s ability to project their power throughout the world, especially into the Middle East and Africa and basically the entire global infrastructure. We would also create dollar vulnerability. Europe could call in more U.S. debt, dump their dollar reserves, sending the value of our currency into this death spiral. And the U.S. economy, which relies on the dollar being the global reserve currency, could collapse. So that's number one, right? That's just fissures in NATO. But number two, you would drive Europe. You could possibly, in a doomsday scenario, drive Europe into the hands of China, right? Like if your favorite restaurant closes, you go and find another favorite restaurant, right? We already see the U.S. already sees Europe with distrust, right? There's been obviously this blockade in purchasing Greenland now. If this is reciprocated, right, could European nations that already have ties with Beijing fall into their arms? Could Germany and France and others conclude that maybe strategic autonomy means colluding more with Beijing and diversifying away from the US? There's a risk there, right? We want our allies to be our friends and not become our enemies. Thirdly, all this empowers Russia and China. Biju, you alluded to this, right? This legitimizes what Russia and China are doing in their own global strategy. Every argument Putin has made about Crimea or Ukraine, or every argument that China now makes about Taiwan, all of these become easier to justify when Washington now abandons their own rules and seeks Greenland. And so they could say the Americans took Greenland, and so international borders are negotiable by force, right? If American can do it, why can't we? And so we run these three major risks, right? Major fissures within NATO and Europe, driving Europe towards China, and empowering Russia and China to pursue their own aggressive global strategy. But looking at all of this, right, are there better alternatives to accomplishing U.S. strategic goals instead of tariffs? Like if you and I had an ear at the White House tomorrow, or maybe, had a desk at the State Department with Marco Rubio. What would we say? What could we suggest as better alternatives?
The question becomes like, so I'll give you a list of maybe like you could argue they're better alternatives, right? The issue is, and I think this is a problem, it's not that they have not been explored. I can't imagine they have not been explored through our diplomatic channels. It's that we have not been able to land at a place where we feel comfortable with the overall security of the US and the broader Western Hemisphere. So I'll just quickly go down a few thoughts in terms of alternate strategies. One is the Compact of Free Association. It's called the COFA. So US could offer Greenland the same deal it gives to the Marshall Islands. Sovereign independence, but US provides defense and subsidies. Everyone wins. Denmark keeps its sovereignty and its dignity. Greenland gets its freedom and the US gets its minerals. The other way is to lock in a trilateral governance. So, for example, you can strengthen the US-Greenland Joint Committee that was formed about 20 years ago and embed Denmark formally, making it a forum where you make all the decisions on basis, infrastructure, any major investments. So that way you can all keep a close eye and governance structure in place. You can also update the defense agreements to guarantee long-term US access to the tools, the base, while explicitly recognizing Greenlandic self-rule and Denmark's sovereignty. So you're avoiding any fears that we will do any back channel any back channel moves. I think we also have to think about economic de-risk, and this is not an alternate strategy. It's probably a coupling of strategies where we can coordinate with the EU and Nordic investments in Greenland's infrastructure, critical mineral projects, make sure that there are credible non-Chinese options so we can have an actual solution for the people where they themselves feel like they are gaining from it. I remember reading that there was a project where after some time, the ownership shifted to an American company and a whole lot of Greenlanders lost their jobs. So these kind of things are worrisome to Greenlanders. So we have to also, while we are doing that, link any of those deals that we do from a resource perspective to environmental protections and making sure that local jobs are also protected so that they perceive our involvement and the initiatives to also help them. So as long as they help, right? We always talk about the simple phrase that it's all about economy, right? So as long as they feel protected, and they're also worried about environment. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but there was an incident in the 1960s, I think early 60s or late 50s, where one of our planes crashed and it had a nuclear payload on board and it corrupted the environment. There were like nuclear exposure to people around that area, and so people still fear. There are a group of people who are anti-mining that fear that if you start mining in those locations, you may dig up some of those materials that are now frozen below, and it's going to cause issues. So we need to make sure that we are sensitive to these concerns. We can also, another option would be to develop like a NATO branded mission for the Arctic, which is actually a great idea, like the Arctic Sentry. And under that umbrella, make sure that we always have allied presence around Greenland. Let the Danish keep the lead. It's okay. We don't have to throw them under the bus. They can still do that. But we can clearly give the notion to Russia, especially in this case, that any area around Greenland is under Western responsibility and protection. And in addition to all this, I would definitely also recommend using soft power and like expand climate research, get involved in their education and health partnerships, like lift up the region and what they feel in terms of social benefits. Don't just only make it look like it's military and economic. So make a holistic strategy so the people of Greenland itself feel like they're gaining a lot from the relationship. And that way, we don't have to really make it a US territory of anything. We can just make sure under this alliance umbrella, we create the structure we need to keep China away through the joint committee. We have a force present to keep away Russia, and it could be a win-win without having any of these issues that even you mentioned, which some of them are terrifying.
Amazing. Yeah, those are excellent points. You should really run for public office one day. If you're a listener and you're listening to this podcast and you think Biju's amazing, write a comment and let us know that, Biju should maybe run for office. Those are excellent points. And, to get back to the idea of tariffing to submission, in terms of better alternatives than public chastising and tariffs, decades of friendly negotiation have not worked. U.S. assets are clearly being abused, right? It's like that little boy in the corner who cries all day and then he just blows up. I think the US right now has decided we're done, right? You're taking billions and billions of dollars for decades and we're done. Playing a strong hand is tough. It's unpopular, but in my perspective, I think this is a good move. Normally, family drama, right, should stay in the kitchen between the US and Europe and NATO. But sometimes a public spanking is good, right? Sometimes it teaches you a lesson. Your solutions were great, Biju. I think all reasonable proposals should have underlying conceptual models where we talk about shared revenue agreements for any type of mining that does take place. Autonomy of the Greenlandic people, right, should be a important decision, allowing them to vote in terms of how they want to be governed. Having a shared participation model with the EU is important as well. And I'll mention this point. So, preservation of NATO unity is essential in the acquisition of Greenland, right? This can't be a lone man strategy. Simply put, in terms of raw power and numbers, Russia is far ahead of any infrastructure in the Arctic region. Russia has 40 icebreakers, including 8 nuclear powered, while the US has only 2 polar icebreakers, with the main reinforcement coming from our allies, all the allies we're suspicious of. Canada, 18 icebreakers, Finland, 8, Sweden, 5. In the sensors, undersea domain, network logistics, the advantage lies with the US and its allies. But here's the key: all this is a network of facilities, of technology, of joint radar systems, continuous data exchange. This cannot be managed by one country. We need NATO and our European allies, especially our Nordic allies, right, to partner with us in a way that is agreeable. A rupture with Europe would mean logistical death, right? It would result in expensive, slower, less predictable US management of resources in the Arctic region, or even deployment of resources. How would we increase our supply ships, our icebreakers, our infrastructure needed to run that region? Not only a fissure within NATO, it sends the message to Moscow that we are divided. Now, when there's pressure on underwater infrastructure or accidents at sea or shows of force, the question is who's responsible? Is the US responsible to handle this? Is the EU responsible? Is the Danes responsible? Who exactly do we need to court now to get our win? And so, from a Moscow perspective, right, the most powerful deterrent to their force is a unified NATO and EU and US force managing that region, not a lone wolf country. And so it's important to think about these things, right? We need to ask ourselves, how can we as a country pursue Greenland with the backing of our friends and our neighbors in the region to create a region that is safe for all of us. And so, something to keep an eye on in the news. You may have never heard of Greenland before. Maybe you never heard of the city of Nuuk, but now it's been all over the news in the last 2 weeks. We encourage our readers to listen in, gather your thoughts from the news, open your Bible, ask yourself why this is important to American interests, right? Because even though this doesn't affect your Monday morning commute or your pay raise next week, these geopolitical events are important to the long-term stability and safety of everything that we do in our own communities. And so we'll end there. Any final thoughts, Biju, before we conclude?
Overall, I would say the US's strategic instincts about Greenland are not new, and they are mostly justified. But the approach of imposing tariffs on allies and talks of purchasing and military annexation that collides with legal, political, and moral views of today. And I would say that there is one of the things I've heard is that there is legitimate concern in Washington that the EU and NATO is moving too slow when compared to the pace needed in the 21st century, hot or cold warfare. And if that's the case, let's fix that. Right? There's no need to completely blow up and alienate our allies. And bottom line, we need more friends, not less.
Yeah, excellent final thoughts. It'll be interesting to see how this story actually develops in the next few weeks because it is fascinating to see this public, very visible, very loud fissure within NATO and the US. So, again, thank you for listening. We encourage our listeners to like and subscribe, and we'll be back next week for another episode. Thanks, everyone.